welcome to Math 317. Let's call it day 27, give or take. What I want to do today is talk about a meeting I had with a local business that does have an opportunity for student involvement in a project. The problem is this is being recorded, and I do not want to give away information about the people and their company. So what I will do is we will just talk in generality about how would you attack a problem like this. And for a lot of things, you can actually do a tremendous amount just by formulating things in generality. How many of you have done physics? Good. Give me a 1 over r squared force. And I want it to be the one I'm thinking of.
Gravity?
No. There's really only two choices. If it's not gravity, what am I thinking of? Electromagnetism. The force between two charges. If you had said electromagnetism, I would have said no, gravity. Yeah. But when you have a 1 over r squared force, and you want to see how things evolve, it doesn't really matter for a lot of stuff. Is it gravity or is it electricity and magnetism? The equations are similar. And so if you can solve one set, you can then apply it to another. So we have some company. And I was debating showing you clips from the Rodney Dangerfield movie Back to School. Has anybody seen this? Okay. Who plays the best friend? This is the cultural extra credit. Who plays the best friend of Rodney Dangerfield's son?
Robert Downey Jr.
Yes. Who later became less famous for his role in Iron Man. They don't give him nearly enough credit for his job as the crazy college kid who actually pranks kids during swim meets. So in this movie, the main character, Rodney Dangerfield, flunks out of high school, but he becomes a very successful businessman selling big and tall clothes. And his son is struggling in college and is about to be kicked out of an elite liberal arts school. And his father's encouraging him, you're nothing without an education, stay in school. And the kid goes, well, that's easy for you to do, Dad, you don't have to do it. So, fine, I'll do it with you. I used to think the movie was a comedy. It is actually a documentary. If people want, I am happy to show this in class. I believe this strongly that there's a lot of wonderful lessons to learn from how he interacts with people. And his interactions with the economics professor are just absolutely a riot in terms of how is the real world versus how are things in your ivory tower. Or you want to pour concrete in this tower? Well, let me tell you who you got to talk to first before you. So, in terms of what we want to do for this company, there are a lot of things that sometimes cannot be said explicitly. And I know some of you are working with local companies where there are definitely concerns that companies have, but they cannot always say them explicitly, or at least have the workers know. And so what I want to do is imagine we have some company, and it makes a product. If you really know the movie Back to School, what is the product? Widgets. Some fictional product. And so the company needs to decide how to allocate their resources. So what kind of resources are we going to have to deal with?
Financial resources.
So what kind?
Money. You have a limited amount of money to spend.
So you have a limited type of money. What might you have to spend money on?
Human capital.
I'm sorry?
Human capital.
Human capital. And what other kind of? Physical capital. So you might need materials. You might need space. And then a lot of the concerns are going to be, is it better to buy or to rent? How much of your money do you want to tie up, especially if you're starting business, in actually purchasing a facility versus actually renting a facility? Now when you have workers, the workers are going to have different skill sets. And the widgets are going to require not just materials, but different types of skill sets. Your facility, what kind of costs are you going to have for your facility? Right now it doesn't matter if we're renting or owning, but we have a facility. What kind of costs are they going to be? Equipment.
Maintenance.
So equipment. Okay, what else?
Utilities.
Utilities, excellent. What kind of cost is equipment? Fixed or variable? This I would say is mostly fixed. What about maintenance? I would say that's variable. So why would maintenance be a variable cost?
You might have a machine that can do 10,000 or 20,000 production cycles.
Right, and so the more the machine is used, the faster it might break down. Now the question is, does the machine break down after doing a certain number of items or just a certain number of hours being run? Does it matter the rate at which it's being used? And in the utilities, clearly that's going to be variable. Who knows what the blue laws are? If you're under 21, you might not know what a blue law is.
You're talking about like not selling alcohol or like running businesses on Sundays?
Yes, a lot of places cannot sell alcohol on Sundays in various states. So in New Jersey, they just built a tremendously large mall. But because of the blue laws, they cannot sell alcohol in this monster facility on Sundays. And the question is whether or not this is going to have a huge financial impact. What is the advantage of having a blue law and having no alcohol sold on Sundays? This is an interesting question to ask college students. Kirsty, how many people here are 21 or older? Okay, for those of you who are not, there is this thing called alcohol that you will learn about when you turn 21. You magically learn how to open the can and drink. It's from the open end. Yes?
Nobody has a Monday morning hangover?
Sure. We can imagine that because alcohol is not sold on Sunday, that nobody will have a hangover
Or at
on
least
Monday.
less likely to have it.
You might be less likely, yes, because if you run out of alcohol, you can't replenish.
You encourage people to over-purchase on Saturdays?
You encourage people to over-purchase on Saturdays. What is good about over-purchasing on Saturdays? Boy, does that sound like something that could be taken
People
out of
get paid on
context.
Fridays?
Okay, so actually, this is not a bad thing, is depending on when you get paid, if you have money in your hand, you are more likely to buy things. Now, one of the great advances in Vegas is phenomenal advances, is in slot machines. When you win, they no longer spit out the money. Because what happens if you have a bunch of money? You might take it. You have an electronic credit. So when the money's not in your hand, it's more likely to just keep playing for a little bit longer. So there's the possibility of you have the paycheck. But what else is a possible consequence of the blue laws? So I want you to be thinking when you're doing consulting projects, all the different things that could be coming into play. That's why I want to spend a whole class just talking about this. There are other things about, from a business's perspective, are you happy or upset that you must be closed on Sundays? What do you think? Do you think businesses support this or against this? And you can give me an argument on both sides.
Well, you don't have your variable costs on Sundays.
You don't have your variable costs on Sundays. So if you're all closed on Sunday, then you don't have to hire workers on Sunday. And assuming that demand is constant, that just means people purchase earlier in the week. And then you only have 6 days rather than 7 days of having to pay worker salaries. So if that is true, if you actually don't lose demand, it's beneficial for businesses.
Well, it might be that people actually drink less on Sundays anyways.
So it might be because, you are supposed to be going to, I won't say where you're supposed to be going to, but the thought is people were supposed to be going to certain activities on Sunday and would not be needing to consume alcoholic beverages. So this is one of the reasons why businesses might like blue laws. Why might they dislike blue laws?
It means no Sunday purchases.
So it means no Sunday
And
purchases.
also, particularly, people might buy other things while having an additional trip to get alcohol, like Cheetos or something.
Right. So one thing is the alcohol a leading item that gets people into the store to then buy other things? For movie theaters, a lot of times they will play movies where it's $1 to get in, it's air conditioned, we have reasonably priced soda and popcorn, and they just want you in buying the concessions. Now again, it depends on the types of stores. The liquor stores, how much do people actually buy non-alcoholic stuff at the liquor store? But a supermarket, a lot of supermarkets do have bottles of wine and beer in some places. Yes?
Well, there are some states where you can buy everything in supermarkets.
There are some states where you can buy everything in supermarkets. So this was a rough sketch of a comic strip I saw years ago. And this was called A Restaurateur's Understanding of Physics. So they put up a no smoking sign, and the smoke magically stops at the boundaries of the no smoking section of the restaurant. And then the people who are here have nothing to fear from secondhand smoke because there's a no smoking sign, and the smoke knows not to go into the no smoking section. So this was the restaurateur's understanding of physics. What is a reason businesses might not like the blue laws? Should be something related to this with boundaries.
Not everyone has to follow the blue law.
Okay, so be more specific. So how would that
There's a
affect?
substitution, so you can just go to another store on Sundays, and then if you like that store better, you might lose business entirely because they're open 7 days a week.
But wouldn't that business also be bound by the blue laws?
Not all states are bound
Not all states. So where do you think the blue law has the biggest impact?
on state borders.
On state borders. If you're near the border and you can cross the border without too much trouble into a state that doesn't have the blue law.
I've heard that you don't need to be near the border to do this because people in Boston use it direct to New Hampshire to buy alcohol.
Well, they were really going there for fireworks, and as long as they're going for fireworks, they might as well get some booze. But no, you will have people, depending on how much you want to, is it worth driving all the way to New Hampshire? From Boston, that is still a significant drive. I don't know if that's quite worth going all the way to Boston, all the way from Boston to New Hampshire, but I could see people who are especially in border communities with, for 10 or 15 minutes, I gotta do my shopping, might as well do my shopping in New Hampshire today, get the alcohol. So what is the impact of this? Who does it hurt the most? Who does it help the most?
I mean, it hurts stores near the state border that are selling alcohol, and it helps the ones on the state border on the other side.
Correct. And so in fact, if you were in New Hampshire, you would probably strongly support the blue laws in Massachusetts, right? And you might have campaign contributions, and you might help fund events like that. There's a lot of very interesting rules about what you are allowed to do in terms of selling alcohol and advertising alcohol. And a lot of these cases have gone to the US Supreme Court in terms of what can you include in an advertisement. So when we're looking at something like this, like variable costs are tremendously important for companies. And if you can do all of your work in fewer days, is that worthwhile? A lot of times you have to look at how contracts are structured. So give me some things that might matter about how contracts are structured for workers.
Is there a minimum number of shifts they have to work in a week?
Okay, is the minimum number of shifts?
Are they paid by the hour or by the year?
Are they paid by the hour or by the year? So for my salary is fixed by the year. It doesn't matter if I work later or more. My salary from Williams is independent. But for a lot of workers, what happens if you work above a certain amount? Overtime. So does the company want overtime workers or not? And again, for anything, I want 2 answers. I want a yes answer and a no answer. So give me you're shaking your head that they don't, so give me.
I mean, because you have to pay 1.5 times as much for an equivalent amount of work.
Good, so you have to pay 1.5 times as much for an equivalent work.
You don't have to pay more benefits.
You don't have to pay more benefits. And so this is where the calculations get really interesting about all the things you want to figure in. So overtime, more per hour, but the benefits are fixed. It is often tremendously difficult to figure out just how much something really costs. Is it cheaper to fly, to drive, or to take the train? How would you determine the answer? Depends, but how would you determine the answer?
In terms of money and time spent.
Sure, in terms of money and time spent, so you can see how much does it cost to get from A to B by train, by car, and by plane, and you can see how much the time is. And now the problem is they will have different costs and different amounts of time. I'm actually willing, I'm going to be careful because this is being recorded, I think it is a good use of the funds I have available for me to fly from some places to places. Even if I have to fly from Albany down to Charlotte and then up to Maine, rather than driving directly to Maine, because I can actually work on the plane or sleep or do something like that, whereas if I'm driving, it may be a cheaper cost, but I don't have the benefit of that time to work. The problem is, how much does it really cost? You have to then look at how much is the government spending to subsidize highway construction? How much is it spending to subsidize the rail network? How much is it spending to subsidize the airlines? And so the true cost is often very hard to figure out. We can look at the easy cost of, given the expenditures our society is already doing. Now there are interesting incentives you can try to give people. Where do you think you might give incentives for people to choose one mode of transportation?
The school's trying to cut down on carbon emissions, they might incentivize driving instead of flying.
Okay. Or probably carpooling. But this wouldn't work in all parts of the country. Where can you see people being encouraged to take public transportation and having it make an impact? Yes, cities. And in fact, you often don't have enough space to park. When I lived in Philadelphia, there was a couple of years where parking was extremely tight, and it was cheaper to illegally park and get a ticket than to actually park in a garage and pay the price. And people had mentioned this to City Hall. And in their finite wisdom, after several years, they finally changed the cost of a parking ticket. But this is something that should have been corrected immediately. There was an incentive for people. I did not have a car in Philadelphia. My car was kept in New Jersey, so it didn't really affect me. But it was a terrible structure. You have a lot of drains on cities. You only have so many spaces. You only have so much space on the road. You want to cut down on traffic. You want to encourage people to drive to train stations and take the train in. So when we're trying to figure out the costs, there's a lot of different things to look at. A huge part of the benefits is medical. That's not going to change if you are working more hours. What are the other advantages or disadvantages of time and a half?
Productivity might be lower,
Productivity might be lower. Why?
because if you're already working 40-hour weeks, you're spent, so you can't do as much with the next 10.
So it could be productivity issues. Yes?
There might be less incentive to do your work in workers might want to work from their time straight though they're being paid.
So here's the question. If I'm trying to retain workers, do you think workers would want the opportunity to do time and a half? So maybe incentives to keep workers.
And maybe like business is good and labor market's tight, so.
Right, so you might not have availability. You're not always able to just pull in more people, especially more trained people. Who knows what the Mendoza line is?
Is that baseball?
It is baseball.
It was like this one really, it's like if your batting average is below a certain terrible threshold, like
Terrible is too strong of a word.
mediocre, I don't know, it's like the replacement level.
It's
like,
the replacement level.
Which you get pulled up from
So
someone
the
gets pulled up from
majors, you have the major leagues in baseball, with teams like the Red Sox and the anti-Yankees. And then you have AAA, AA, single A, and you have a lot of other, semi-pro leagues. Then you have what's called the quadruple A player, who's basically on the cusp of AAA and the majors. He's not really good enough to start in the majors, but if somebody goes down in the majors, you can bring this person up. And it's essentially the replacement available. And the Mendoza line is if your statistics are below this level, you're really not good enough to be coming up to the majors. And this is kind of like a nice demarcation line. And the assumption is always that you have plenty of people available at the Mendoza level in your AAA club, that you can bring these people up. And when you're trying to see how valuable is somebody, you always want to compare them to who's your available replacement. So for the company we're going to be looking at, they're going to have some real issues about how many shifts do they want to have? How many people do they want to hire? Do they want to have a lot of overtime or not? What is the availability of hiring more people? Is it something where they can just put out a job advertisement and get people? If so, will they be able to do the tasks? So it's skilled versus unskilled labor. And there's a whole variety of what skilled labor means. For a lot of these jobs, the more you've done it, the better you are. You might actually start to have efficiencies. And so if you're working more hours, there's the great expression, I think you need 10,000 hours to become a master at something. And so if you're working a lot of overtime, you might start getting better at a lot of these things. And you might get better faster, in which case you might become more productive. The other thing to consider is your rent is fixed. So you might be able to get more shifts in by having people do overtime. You know, you've already paid for the rent. And if you want to figure out how much is the cost per unit, that's now being distributed across more shifts. So depending on what the availability is, it might be worthwhile to have people doing overtime. So can anybody give me another reason why we might be concerned about overtime, either pro or con?
I mean, you can mention it, but like education of workers.
Okay.
If you have a certain number of workers and you want to reduce overtime and bring the people on, you have to then spend resources bringing them up to speed.
So there's all, I mean, these are just some of the many issues that are going on. And again, the more features you capture, the better your model is going to be, the more comfortable you're going to be about using the answers. Now, the next thing that we want to keep track of is that when they're building the widget has many sub-widgets that all come together. And so what you need to do is you need to make the sub-widgets, which are then assembled into the widget. And so you have workers who have different skill sets. So right now, the company is asking its workers to fill out time cards that state how many hours they spent on each task. What are the advantages and disadvantages, and what are the dangers of time cards?
You can't have people doing nothing all day because they're being held to a standard.
So one thing is by documenting what you've done, it does force you hopefully to be a little bit more accountable. Now, of course, you could be saying, you know, I spent my day doing blah, and there was really, or there was a good Minesweeper game, or whatever.
Well, if you're making sub-widgets, it should translate directly to an output. So.
Right, and you should be able to see, you know, how many widgets or sub-widgets have you made and get some sense of people's efficiencies. Yes?
Sorry, I was
Okay. Okay. What else is an advantage or disadvantage of time cards?
This is actually a handout. If people are focusing their time on keeping track of their time card, they might actually be taking time away from working.
Right. So because this is being recorded, I will not say the following story is about my brother. And I will not say it deals with a company where he used to work. But there was a company where some person decided it was essential for all employees to fill out time cards. And it was necessary because they were doing a lot of different projects, a lot of them for the government. We think we know which government it was for, but it's not always clear. And they needed to make sure that the correct accounts were charged for the work. But it reached the point where it took so much time to fill out the time cards properly that there was a category on the time card for filling out the time card. And with a straight face, this person asked, you know, given how important it is to fill out time cards, I think there should be some incentive, you know, for people who do it properly. And you know, this person comes from a long line of people able to keep straight faces in situations. And the next week was surprised when they were singled out for filling out their time card properly and were given a certificate of time card excellence, which they still have to this day. At which point the other people that come are like, I want a certificate of time card excellence. And of course, once everybody got their certificate, they no longer cared. But they wanted to have, so you know, for a short period of time, it actually did work, and it actually did motivate people. If you can explain to somebody why it's being done and it's not too onerous, it's not bad. But when you are looking at trying to get a sense of people's skills, if you know how long each person is spending on each task, you can get a sense of who are your good workers for various things. Yes.
I don't understand why employees aren't just motivated to lie and say that they made all the sub widgets themselves.
Well, they're just writing down what task they were on throughout the day.
Oh, okay, so they don't report, they don't say I made 12 or something.
Right, but we can look at how much was done.
Right, okay, and based on the different groupings of who works on which days,
Ah.
you just do it.
So you mentioned one of the
Matrix
ones I
or
really
whatever.
care about.
I mean, 'cause you wouldn't be able to isolate individual workers.
It depends on what the project is.
I mean, yeah, you in theory could, but you would also, that would be assuming that who workers work with doesn't have any effect.
Right, and in fact, that's the point I want to get to right now. Has anybody worked in the restaurant field other than myself? Okay, I worked in a fast food, seafood for 2 years, and then I was able to climb up to a family food. So where did you guys work?
I was like a snack bar for a country club. I don't think that really counts, but
No.
it was food service.
Right.
I made French fries and burgers,
You made French fries and burgers. What kind of restaurant?
like a snack shack.
Okay, snack shack. So the first place I worked at, the Cream and Cone, the boss was a phenomenally hard worker. His entire family worked there. They worked summers, and then they didn't have to work as much during the rest of the year. He was there every day, every shift. And he worked hard. And he expected his workers to work hard. And nobody was ever just standing around doing nothing. Partly because when they were open, just tremendous lines of people coming through. And if you had nothing to do, there was something that you could always do. And typically, when you're especially low man on the totem pole, the 14-year-old busboy, you make boxes. Because they had a large takeout business. And we can always use boxes. Boxes are not that complicated to take the cardboard paper and fold. After a while, you figure out which is the fastest way to fold. You get really good at assembling and putting them in just the right angle. But that is not going to be something that requires 2 people working in tandem. Okay, I'm going to hold here while you fold down over me, and then we're good. So for something like that, you could actually isolate very easily how many boxes can people make per minute. And you could see what someone is doing. But for a lot of things, you're absolutely correct that groupings matter. So if we are trying to help the company, how would we want to figure out what statistic would we want to look at? Are there any sports statistics that might help us for this?
Box plus
Plus
minus.
minus.
Yeah, the plus minus. So somebody want to say what the plus minus statistic is?
It's like for a certain lineup, how many, like, whenever they were all on the court together, their differential.
Right. So basically you just say, how many points have you scored versus how many points have you allowed with this configuration? So one of the advantages of a statistic like this is it's easy to calculate, right? You look at who's on, you look at how many points scored, subtract how many points allowed. It's really easy. This is the 21st century. We don't need really easy statistics anymore. We have the advantage of having tremendous computational resources. We can just encode everything and then try to figure out what's best. That doesn't mean that we should throw away simple statistics. Out of curiosity, how many of you have never seen a proof of linear regression? Okay, so I'm seeing at least 3 hands go up. How many of you have seen a proof of linear regression but are shaky on it? Okay, so I might then actually do a class on linear regression so that when you gather data, how can you analyze it and try to sniff out relationships? This is one of the most important things we can do. And then there will be there may be a recording malfunction when I start talking about applications of this that I have done in the real world. And just how do you actually convince people to trust certain predictions and certain numbers? Simple statistics have a wonderful advantage of, transparent. I can understand. I can explain this to somebody. It didn't take that. How many of you had never heard of plus minus? Okay. After that explanation, do you understand what plus minus is? So which sports do you think are use plus minus a lot? Basketball, right? Basketball, you should know the plus minus statistic if you play basketball. What else? It's not used as much in soccer. Some people still consider this one of the 4 major sports. Hockey. Yeah. And you can look at what's going on in hockey. Very similar to basketball in terms of number of people you have in play at once. Why might plus minus be a bad statistic?
If you're in like a football team, you have so many people on the field at once, and you have kind of teams of people that are going on and off, and having one individual person's statistic might not be so useful.
Well, but the whole point is you're looking at what you're doing with different configurations.
In football, offense and defense are different people.
So offense and defense are different people, but you can then look at how is your defense doing. And you can see maybe how many yards you're giving up.
Yeah.
Now, when you're doing something like football, how many people do not know much about football? Okay, so in football, whichever team has the most yards at the end of the day wins, right? No? Oh, it's not just about total yardage. It's about strategic yardage, right? The goal is to score. It doesn't matter how many yards you get if you can't actually cross the threshold. Same thing for soccer. Shots on goal doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's did you get the ball in? Can anybody give another example that will be very relevant in less than a year?
Like elections.
Yeah, for the elections. It's the Electoral College. And you take about 100,000 people in a swath of certain states in the Midwest, and you flip them, and 2016 would have been very different. So in a lot of these things, you want to make sure you're looking at the right statistic. So a lot of people are reporting national polls don't really matter. The way things are structured, it's what's really going on in certain battleground states. Now, when you're looking at plus minus, you want to isolate, if possible, the value of an individual. One of the ways to do that is to see how well they work with other people. How many people have ever seen the movie Miracle? Great movie. So who are the coneheads? It's a reference to 3 characters from Saturday Night Live. And in the movie, there are these 3 hockey players who, they're not individually superstars, but together they just know where the others are, and the 3 of them just play well together. And just when the 3 of them are on the ice, they just click, and they just know how to go. And so, what's the value of them individually? But the 3 of them together were a potent force. And that's where a statistic like plus and minus is extremely valuable. But there's something that the plus minus is not taking into account. And this is not going to be relevant for the business, but just since we're talking about plus minus.
But in like basketball, a lot of bench players have good plus minus because they're playing against other bench players.
Right. And so when you look at it, let's say both teams have gone to their benches, and then some of the starters come back on your team, but not on the other team, and you come in as one of the bench players, or you're already on there as a bench player. So maybe you have 3 starters and 2 benches versus 5 benches on the other side. You should probably have a good plus minus. So what you would really want to do is you would want to take into account the plus minus and take into account who's your opposition and have some kind of weight against who you are. I don't think there's a defense in the construction of the widgets and the sub-widgets. I don't think we have to worry about that. But I want you to be thinking as much as possible about any statistic you're looking at. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? How far should you go with it? And over here, it's going to be extremely important for the company to figure out which workers work well together. As an example, imagine you have a restaurant or a coffee shop or a bookstore, something like that, and you have staff. You might have some staff who are extremely good and some staff who provide a wonderful opportunity for training. Consistently. You probably don't want to have 2 excellent trainee candidates, working a shift by themselves. And so when you're scheduling things, you might want to take into account how you match people up. You might want to be very careful about which hours do certain people get. We can put this person in late in the day when there's not too much business. Or if we know that there's going to be a huge rush, or we know that big guns, famous people are going to come in, we have somebody else there. Okay. So these are extremely important things that the company is going to need to figure out as to which workers do they want working together, how much overtime is it worth getting, one of the big fears a lot of companies have is retention of people. And what happens if you lose people? Related to this, I'll put it over here, is inventory. So any thoughts about what inventory might mean?
The amount of stuff that you have that you need to make the stuff yourself.
Okay, so good. So this is stuff you need for construction. What else?
Unsold widgets.
I'm sorry?
Unsold.
Unsold widgets. So what are the issues with having unsold widgets?
You've paid for them, but you haven't gotten money back for them.
You've paid to make them, but you haven't sold them yet. So what do you have to do?
Store them.
Storage costs. So the storage cost is a minus. What's the plus?
You have the capital right there, but they hold value.
Well, the capital would be, I think, the stuff I have under the materials. What would be the advantage of having unsold widgets?
Lowers your total profit.
Yeah, that's not an advantage. I want an advantage.
Variable demand.
Variable demand. Okay, so why would that be good?
Unexpected periods of higher demand.
Yeah. If somebody all of a sudden wants your product, and your product takes a while, you can actually supply it immediately. There's tremendous advantage of being known that you can get it done. There are certain customers that you cannot afford to let down. They're big, and you need to make sure you always have stuff on reserve. Who here is potentially interested in finance? All right, so I will assume the rest of you are consulting. Yeah, this is Williams. All right. What do banks have to keep?
Cash on hand.
They have to keep cash on hand. How much? Depends. But banks have to keep a certain amount on hand as a function of how much they have lent out. Why?
If everyone comes running, to be able to pay them back.
Yeah, you've got to be able to have the resources to pay people back if there's a run. And a lot of times you can actually create a run on banks by saying certain things publicly. So there's tremendous complicated factors that go into how much stuff do we want to keep. A lot of it is going to be a function of how high are the storage costs. If the storage cost is essentially zero, is it worth keeping a lot of things? And then you just take the stuff you need later.
Also assuming that there's no assuming widgets don't mold.
Right, so you will assume that there's no decay. Now, give me an example of something where there will definitely be decay. Hamburgers, right? So when you're a McDonald's, how many hamburgers do you make in advance? Well, you have some good idea of how many hamburgers they're going to be on demand, and you can just monitor what your inventory is. Years ago, back when we had 4 neighborhoods, I was the faculty program advisor for Spencer. I'm not sure if I was also the faculty program director for all the neighborhoods. One of my favorite students was the student director of Dodd, and they were doing a barbecue one day at noon. What should he have done?
Started grilling at like 11:30.
Yes. So starting to grill at noon for a barbecue that starts at noon. Good idea or bad idea? Very bad idea. So I showed up a little bit before noon just to check in and see how things were going, and I saw that the grills were lit. He goes, well, what's going on? Oh, yeah, we thought we'd light the grills at noon. Light the grills now, just start opening up meat and just start throwing meat on the grill right now. Just get things cooking. And then right now, we're going to just make as much meat as we can, and then we'll start throwing things on and we'll start adjusting as the event goes on as to how much do we want to keep in reserve. You want to have enough food cooked so when people come, they don't have to wait too long. But as the day progresses, as you get closer to the end, then you start making less and less, and you start monitoring the flow. With a straight face, I actually said, I noticed we've got some hamburgers and cheeseburgers. We don't have any M&M burgers. And I said it with a really good straight face. I come from a long line, and we actually made M&M hamburgers. Some people actually like them. I agree with, but variable cost, food products are very easy to go bad after a fixed amount of time. If you have something that is more long-term, like a computer's probably not going to go bad if you store a lot. What do you have probably where you can have a lot of extra things that are being stored that you may not need, that you may destroy or remove later? Trying to phrase it without giving it away. It's very different from when I was a kid. Where you'll take a lot of this and then you'll only keep the ones you need later.
Notes.
So one is notes, but there's a little bit of a cost for taking a note. So this technology did not exist when I was a kid. Or it existed, but photos. How many of you snap just a large number of photos and only keep a small subset later? What's the storage cost for you guys for photos? Virtually nothing, right? The amount of space you have. I might have mentioned John Adams, who's the direct descendant of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. My father worked for him. I think he was the one who said, as the cost of memory asymptotically goes to zero, what you can do. When I was a kid, the first computer I had that I could program on, it took 7 minutes to load Flight Simulator. It was on an old cassette tape. We got the extra 16 kilobyte memory expansion so that we could write some really serious code. The amount of storage space was incredible. The floppy disks were about a little over 700K. The better ones a little bit later, 3.5, were like 1.4 megabytes. And so I'm always excited when something I'm doing is greater than 1.44 megabytes. I feel like I've done something. Right now, it really costs you nothing to just take extra pictures. And you can store them on your phone or online or whatever. And so you really want to be thinking, what is the cost? What is the advantage of being able to turn out an order quickly? How likely are you to have somebody who's going to come by and say, I need this quickly. If you can deliver it for me, that's great. If not. And then the last thing I want to talk about before we end today is the widgets. How much do you want to customize them? So can somebody give me a movie with a person who is high maintenance? And just some more cultural extra credit. From their food preferences. Classic romantic comedy. When Harry Met Sally, if you listen to her order in a restaurant, it's almost as long as a James Joyce sentence. In terms of precisely how she wants her meal prepared. I think Billy Crystal remarks at one point, she will have ways of thinking of preparing the food that the chef himself or herself has not even thought of. How many of you have seen My Cousin Vinny? What does the menu say in My Cousin Vinny when they go to the diner? Nope. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. And they look at the menu and they go, breakfast? You think? 2 breakfasts. The complete opposite. What's the advantage of customizable?
Customers like generally to be able to make decisions.
Generally, customers like to make decisions. Sometimes you don't, because now there's so many choices, it actually makes it harder. It's a little bit easier when you only get into one good college, or only get one good job offer, because then you don't have to agonize over which one to do. But for most things, we would actually like to have different options. Are you more likely to have more sales or less sales if you can customize? What do you think?
Less.
So less sales if you can customize.
You can't buy in bulk. Like my mom can't go and pick up for my whole family.
Okay, so if you customize, it might increase the cost per unit because you can't build in bulk. And if you increase the cost per unit, it then might make the product unattractive to more people. So you could actually argue customizable is either good or bad. There is a tremendous advantage of being able to build in bulk and have all the different pieces and assemble. So the question is, which things can you customize without too much trouble? So give me a product with something that you can customize without too much trouble.
Car,
Car. What part of the car?
all the interior bits, well, then the color, I guess.
So the color, I think, is the easiest thing that you can customize. You know, it's just what color do I spray paint it at the end? And if you are making enough cars, you can afford to have paints of all the different types, so that's not going to be a big deal. The inside might actually be a little bit harder in terms of the customizing, but there's a lot of these things that you can do. When we bought my car, we took it for a test drive, and we were told that there was only one thing different from the car and the one we were going to get. It turns out there were two things. It didn't have the back cover to show that, you know, there's nothing in the back trunk. And, you know, this really bothered my wife. It didn't bother me that much. So every time I brought my car back to the dealer, they promised me that they would give me the first available one as soon as it came in. None ever came in. And this went on for 3 years. And then I got a survey from the car company asking me, how are things going? I said, for the most part, they're pretty good. But, you know, it's been 3 years. We haven't gone in the back cover as we were promised. My wife needs a new car. We will not buy a car from your company because of this. In a completely unrelated story, that very afternoon, can you believe it? But one finally showed up at the dealership. It was amazing. You know, the coincidences that can happen in life. And so, which things can you customize and what is the cost? When you are a small company, is it worth having a lot of different products? There's both pluses and minuses. And so when we are looking for these people, these are going to be serious issues to think about. It is not trivial to decide how many types of products do you want. Things that can be customized easily. If you can store a bunch of things and say, look, I've got enough space in the building that I have to store a bunch of these things so that I have the freedom to quickly go this way or that way. That's wonderful. So the purpose of today's lecture was to just really drive home a lot of the issues if you try to go and talk to people. So almost any of these problems, you can say, you know, pro or con, what do you want? You know, you can find a positive or negative spin on any of these things. You need to gather data. And so to make a real world analysis, you're going to need data. So the company is thrilled to be working with us. And so if people are looking for a project, this is a great one. It is a regional company. It's employing people. It has good relations with the local government. And they are very interested. There's a Williams connection. So one of the big guns of the company graduated from Williams. I'm trying to get either him or someone else from the company to come and speak to us. But it's a great sense of, a great experience to see what happens when you try to apply. So now, what would we use to solve something like this? We spend all the time talking about this. How would we actually solve this? Yeah, this is actually something where when you go out to the industry, we could actually use what we did in this class. And binary variables of looking at people working together. Now, in terms of trying to find the grouping of the plus and minus, how would we find this out? Would we find this out by linear programming? How would we find that out?
That would be a system of equating the matrix, right?
Well, we would put that in, but how would we find the values for this? It's not linear programming. Statistics, right? So hopefully you've done some statistics. And you know, if not, I'll teach you some regression as to how we can actually look at the data and try to get a sense of pairings like this. All right, so I think this is a good place to end.